Thank you for being here. My name is Matthew Reinbold. I'm lead for the Capital One API Center of Excellence. And on behalf of the Center of Excellence and DevExchange, I am pleased to present our very special guest, Kin Lane, the API Evangelist. So exciting to have you here. We've got some questions. We're going to be spending some time talking about APIs, both what happened in the past, where we are today, what the future may hold. So I'm very excited about this.
Sounds like a plan. I'm happy to be here, man.
All right, awesome. So the year that we're recording this, 2017, is very, very important. It is the anniversary, 10-year anniversary of the iPhone being released. And the modern smartphone, as we know it, probably added fuel to the fire for web API adoption, something that had already started with things like Ajax apps. You came along shortly after in 2010, put out API Evangelist, and you've been monitoring and talking about the space ever since. What was the reason? What got your attention about web-based APIs and made you feel like you needed to start the API Evangelist?
Well, I'm a 30 years database guy, so I've been building systems for a number of years. But you fast forward that to the internet coming out, and I'm building applications that run on the web. And around 2005, 2006, I'm doing a lot of work with web services, because at the time I was working for SAP. And so I was working with a lot of web services, but I was playing with APIs. I was playing with web APIs. I'd done some commerce stuff with Amazon, with eBay, and of course with PayPal, and some shipping APIs with UPS, USPS. But really, they didn't capture my attention. I wasn't that excited about them until social came out. So Twitter, Facebook, Flickr, Delicious, all of that. But it was still kind of games. I was still playing with them. I wasn't building anything serious with them. But in 2007, I started actually building business applications to run North American events for SAP. And this new service that I was familiar with because of Amazon came out, called Amazon Web Services. And I was able to deploy servers and storage and email and other things that I needed to operate events in a whole new way using Amazon Web Services. And so before that, I'd have to buy a whole bunch of physical hardware. I'd have to go get spaces in data center. And then the rest of the year, these things would sit in storage because I didn't need them. I was running conferences, big conferences. And so when I started firing it up with Amazon, I stopped buying equipment. I would just scale up what I needed, and I would scale it down when I didn't need it. And I would do this with web APIs or REST-ish APIs. Amazon's not really REST. But so 2007, 2008, I'm deploying global infrastructure using APIs. And at the time, so I'm the VP of technology at a company. We ran all of SAP's events, and we also took over Google's events. And so at the time, SAP's asked me to build mobile apps or web services and APIs for mobile apps. And then I ran the first two Google I/Os. And the first one was when they first gave away the first Android phone. And so I was in charge of giving away these Android devices that everyone was super excited about. And so that's 2009, 2010. And I'm like, well, I'm able to deploy global infrastructure, have these iPhones, and I have these Android phones that everyone's building applications for. I think this thing's going to be something. I think this is going to stick around for a while. And maybe web APIs have some differences that maybe web services didn't quite have. Sure.
What were those differences? Because, SOAP had been around. That was the very enterprisey thing to do. But it certainly didn't have the takeoff like a REST-ish web interfaces. So what were the differences?
Well, SOAP is very, very technical, very developer-oriented, very IT-oriented, very technically sound, but also it's not easy to get up and going sometimes for some developers. There's quite a cognitive load to get going. And web APIs were scrappy, they were cheap, they weren't always well done, still aren't always very well done, but they get the job done. So you're able to do a lot in a shorter amount of time with really cheap web infrastructure, and a lot of developers kind of seem to get it. So when Twitter started doing it and these other APIs, developers were like, hey, this makes sense. This is pretty easy to get going. It works a lot like the web. You're able to take that URL, grab it, and start manipulating it and seeing what happens. And so I think that really kind of widened the spectrum of who would understand APIs.
So 2009, you're still working at SAP, doing all of this amazing stuff. What made the leap? Why did you make the leap to becoming independent? Why did you feel that you couldn't continue on that path with SAP?
I was tired of wearing suits. I was tired of. I'm not an executive type person. I had kind of climbed up the ladders. I was doing very well financially. I was doing very well in the position I had, but I was just not happy in what I was doing. I was actually pretty miserable. And when I had this success with APIs, I was running North American events, and they're like, hey, you're really good at this. You're doing well. Things are performing well. Your budgets are great. How about we give you European events and maybe Southeast Asian events? And I was like, wow, that would really suck, because that means I would never sleep and I would always be traveling and I would never be home. So I just started studying what was going on and just was looking for a change. And I knew I wanted to be independent. I didn't want to do a startup because I'm not really that excited about startups, but I was kind of done with the enterprise.
Okay. I think many would say that you've grown the API Evangelist brand. I know that's probably could be a better word, but you've grown the API Evangelist brand into a recognized independence influencer in the API space. Would you agree that you are an influencer?
I mean, yes, I would. I would say that. Whether in all enterprise circles or all startup circles, whether people listen to me or not, and I actually influence them, I would say no, not always, because I tend to speak more towards what you should be doing right and pretty critical when people are doing things wrong, and I'm not very venture capital oriented. So there are some people who don't listen to me. But yeah, I would say, I mean, after 7 years and 3,000 blog posts and 8 conferences that I've produced myself, there's people listening.
I think you, perhaps more than an individual vendor or particular people working in corporate environments, probably have a better understanding of the responsibilities of having that voice, of being an influencer. What do you have guiding principles about what you say and what you don't say, or have you over time developed lines that you know that you probably shouldn't cross for the good of the community?
I would say, yeah. I mean, first and foremost, my mission is to very much explain to the normals what APIs are. I'm not.
And who are the normals?
The normals are people who are not usually developers, not usually in Silicon Valley, not usually doing startups. They're people at regular businesses, regular organizations, government agencies. People probably don't know much about IT or APIs, and I want to help them understand it. So I saw when I started studying it in 2009 and into 10 that there's a lot of developers that were really mean about whether you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong, and I knew I didn't want to be that.
RTFM?
Yeah. And so I knew I wanted to try to be nice to people, but this is very much externally projecting out of Silicon Valley, out of technology. When it comes to going toe-to-toe with Silicon Valley and startups, I'm not always the nicest. I tend to be fairly critical and tend to tell it like it is. So I would say I don't actually have any lines that I feel. I mean, I try not to be vulgar. I try not to be rude. I try not to make people feel small. But when it comes to talking about topically, I really don't have that many lines, to be honest.
What's the correct way for an enterprise or a company to engage you? Because I know there have been posts or tweets in the past where people have done it wrong. So, you've spent time developing your voice, and you obviously don't just trumpet what companies bring to you. What's the proper way to engage both you and influencers like you?
I would say, start by sharing your story of what you're trying to do and what you're accomplishing, the truth, the challenges. Let's talk about a kind of shared narrative, be honest with me about whether it's on the record or off the record. I'll respect those lines. But, when it comes to, I've had groups come to me and they want to, work with me, tell stories, and things are really nice for about 30 days, 60 days, and then they start getting a little pushier. Hey, you should talk about our product. Hey, we got this new thing happening. We want you there. We want you saying this. And they start getting a little more hands-on with the editorial control without really discussing it with me. I mean, I'm happy to discuss where those lines are and where I should and shouldn't go, because I've worked in DC, so I know how to mind my manners. But if there's not discussion about it, I'm not going to. I'm going to just talk, straight like it is. So really be honest and truthful. Don't start throwing your weight around as an enterprise organization. I've ran. This is my 8th edition of API Strategy and Practice Conference, which we just gave to the Linux Foundation. And so I've dealt with a lot of large organizations that give me large chunks of money and then want their way. And so I'm happy to, make sure you get that return on investment and get good exposure. Just the way that some companies handle it sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired, I would say. So.
The way they handle it, so too controlling or not upfront? I heard a little bit of that.
Both,
not enough
both.
upfront?
I would say they don't really articulate what they want. They're just happy to support what's going on, and then when they don't get a keynote, even though we said up front, hey, there are no keynotes, pay for play, they start getting a little testy. And then similar, just on the content side, when I'm producing stories, guides, and white papers for what I do, they're fine with the first one being very much my editorial direction, and then the second or third one, they're looking for, hey, we need more of a product placement.
More of a call to action.
We need more of a call to action. We need it to make sure none of our competitors are in there. Where I'm pretty big on covering truthfully what the landscape is when I'm talking about a topic. And so if you're telling me to omit companies, I tend to, frown on that. But again, I would say I'm happy to accommodate most things if there's communication. It's when it kind of comes from behind and there's not kind of an upfront communication about it. And I know that makes organizations nervous, so.
Sure. Who are your peers? Who do you look to in the space as also doing the hard work of telling the stories?
Yeah, I mean, when I started in 2010, I would say there wasn't a lot out there. I mean, that's one of the reasons I kind of took on this persona and came out here doing it. Now, I mean, there's, Mike Amundsen, Eric Wild, James Higginbotham.
Your check is in the mail.
Lorinda, is someone that I've been exchanging with. Lorinda Brennan, she works for Capital One. She's someone that has been, gone toe to toe. I've traveled with her around the world, speaking at many events, sharing stories. So these are all people that I would say, I'm the only one who doesn't really have a company that I work with. But in 2010, there was no independent voices without a company. Now there's a wealth of people like this who work at companies. Mike Amundsen, Eric Wild work at the API Academy, which is Computer Associates. You all work, for Capital One. There's quite a few people out there. I'm starting to see strong voices come out of Google that are a little bit more vocal and a little bit more open in the space and communicating and kind of truly evangelizing, not just a product, but kind of the ideas. Sure. And that's what I like to see.
Sure. From a technical standpoint or from a business standpoint, people watching this video might hear you talk about stories and initially be caught off guard. Why are stories so important for something that might be perceived as something that returns business value or something that's a technical specification?
Yeah. I mean, stories are really important to me. It's what I do as the API Evangelist, and I have to kind of talk about where that was rooted. Is when I started API Evangelist, I had just met this young lady, my girlfriend, Audrey Waters, who she has her master's in folklore and storytelling. Okay, so this is actually how stories get told and get retold and how history gets laid down and what becomes, what we know as reality. And at the time, she was working for tech blogs, so she's written for Read Write Web, O'Reilly, and she now has her own blog called Hack Education, which is education technology. And I started API Evangelist at the same time. So I helped her run her infrastructure and set up her blog, and she helped me learn to write and edit my stuff, and kind of helped me plant the seeds of this API storytelling. And it's how I craft stories and how I research the space, craft these stories, and do it in as a genuine way as I can that's not product-oriented. And it's something that I think every company should be doing. You're already telling stories. I mean, venture capital, TechCrunch, all these places are telling stories about what's going to happen, what should happen, what may happen, what will happen if our product's successful. These are stories. I mean, marketing is stories, but it's it's much more devoid of a soul. That soul isn't quite there. So I mean, my goal, not that I always hit it, because I have a lot of boring stories on my blog, but occasionally, I'll hit it just right with the right story, and I've got a couple that, keep producing traffic. I keep seeing people talk about it, and they're stories that are 3 or 4 years old sometimes, and they've just stuck. And people retell them, and I don't have to do the work anymore. So those are the ones that you're always trying to hit. I guess some people would call those viral.
They become part of our shared industry narrative.
Yeah, and I think if you're honest and you're straight up about what you do, people will know it. And if you really work at finding good stories and telling good stories that resonate with folks, people will retell those stories, and that's when you can make the biggest impact.
There's been a number of stories probably in the last 7 years that you've been doing API Evangelists, whether it's IoT or hypermedia or whatever the buzzword du jour of this week happens to be. What, in your opinion, have been the biggest changes in the last 7 years?
I mean, technically, it's the obvious ones of cloud and mobile. Those two that I said were kind of the catalyst for me jumping in this. But I would say it goes beyond the technical. It's really mainstream adoption. I mean, when I first started in 2010, there was Amazon, eBay, there was Twitter, Twilio. There was all these shiny new startups. I mean, new, I guess a decade old is still a startup. I don't know when you stop being a startup. But it wasn't
when
really,
you lose your ping pong table.
That's it, huh? When and then there's this kind of next wave of the Twilios, the Stripes, the SendGrids, the kind of the cool kids of APIs, not necessarily the pioneers, but it was still very all startup. But in 2017, APIs are going pretty mainstream. And we still got a long ways to go, but insurance organizations, healthcare, travel companies, automobile companies, every one of the auto companies have a public API program. Banks, Capital One has an API program, and government agencies, cities. So APIs have gone beyond, I think, the tech community, the tech culture, and I really feel that's bigger than any single technology, whether it be cloud, mobile, or devices. It's really that going mainstream that's going to make this, that next hype, that next trend. Even if it gets a little bit of traction, it's not as much traction as if it's in our homes, our businesses, baked into our daily life, baked into how our government operates. That's where it's going to get good.
Interesting. For every success story that we see with a public API program, you have to imagine there's a dozen or more failed efforts where people came together with a lot of enthusiasm to make a developer platform, and it didn't work out. I'm thinking specifically about ESPN a few years ago that closed its public API portal, saying that they just weren't seeing any benefit to it.
Netflix.
Or Netflix, which obviously does a tremendous amount of API development in the background, but it's no longer publicly consumable. Where do companies go wrong in that kind of effort?
I mean, there's a number of reasons. I mean, I would say in those two cases, you have very entrenched existing industries with high value content that people are very protective of. So I would say both of those, putting content out via public APIs just really scares a lot of people. It's going to cannibalize your business. But really, it's those people in high-level positions that are saying no, or those partners who own that content. Because I've seen a lot of content APIs like that get launched, and then because it was other people's content, which is Netflix, the Netflix model, and I guess somewhat ESPN, but they just make people nervous, and they don't own that content, so those other people really have control. And so when you're trying to launch a public API program and work with partners, and you don't actually have much control over those digital resources, that can be scary. But I've seen that, I would say the common equation is people, in these situations is, I worked for a print company that had a lot of SOAP APIs, web APIs, but they were all private, and they wanted a public API portal. I built it for them, I launched it, went out on the road, And it was actually 2011. It was like my first contract as API Evangelist. And all the sales guys and ladies were intimidated, and they felt very threatened by this, that they were going to be replaced by an API. And so they did everything they could to sabotage me, close it up, mess with me, give me wrong prices, make me look bad when it produced quotes. And so again, another human element of what's happening. And I see just many different scenarios of that where, whoever's doing the API, we tend to be very just enamored with technology and just kind of blinded by it. We think this is going to be cool. We kind of believe the evangelists out there who are saying this is going to fix everything. And then you launch it, but you really don't think about all the human aspects of doing business at your company or in your industry. And it tends to create friction. We tend to not educate people.
Is it fair to say that company culture is a prime
I'd say
driver of whether
culture.
those things become successful or not?
And when you have large organizations, that culture is just even more rooted, even larger. And it's nothing that technology is gonna, I don't care how many buzzwords or acronyms you use, how micro your services are, how, DevOpsy your teams are. You have to communicate, you have to educate, you have to train, work with people, reach out. You have to do lunches, internal events, trainings, workshops, and it takes time, it takes investment. It's not going to happen overnight.
Absolutely. Well, what excites you right now? I mean, you've been doing this for a while. I'm sure sometimes you probably get deja vu when you get the press release and think, well, so-and-so probably did this a few years ago. But surely there's neat stuff coming down the pipeline that excites you.
Yeah, I would say the first thing that I work on that gets me up and keeps me excited every day is I have a project called the Human Services Data API, which is an API definition for how municipalities, cities, and nonprofit organizations share data about human services. So this is in a city. There's the notion of what's called 211. You know what 911 is, but 211 is how you find health and human services. How do I find a doctor? How do I find an STD clinic? How do I find a food bank? How do I get housing assistance? And so this is an API specification that's open source for organizations to be speaking the same language from city to city so that they can share it regionally and share between cities efficiently and then reuse software across them. So that's one I'm the technical lead on. It's kind of my baby. And I'm super passionate about doing it. And I saw we just did a hackathon in Princeton that was, we were building shelter location information for Irma. And we were doing it while Irma happened and helping aggregate data across from FEMA, from local Miami organizations and other Florida organizations, and then just what the grassroots activists were doing, putting it into a common format so that it can be reused across systems. And so that's the main one that gets me up in the day. I mean, I really love doing the human services work and seeing. Secondarily, I do, extending that other government work. I worked for the Obama administration doing open data work, going around to federal agencies, Department of Veterans Affairs, Census, Interior, and helping with open data standards and APIs. And so in 2013, he said that all federal agencies need to go machine readable by default, and I was part of the team that went out and made sure that happened. So I still do that work. I don't work in government. Again, I'm not really big on wearing suits and showing up for work every day. So I still do a lot of this work. I tend to work with agencies. I still consult. I still talk to them. I help them figure out their API strategy, help make sure there's API language in RFPs, RFIs, all the documents that get passed around. And so I'm super passionate about that. And when I get calls, I just did one last week on FOIA, the FOIA API with the GSA, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act.
Oh, okay.
So how do you make sure that the federal agencies are able to produce and be transparent about what they're doing? When they get requests, there's an API to do that. And so the next generation of that, I consult on what are best practices. And then I'm not even to startups yet. I would say after that, it's universities. I work with universities and students. How can they use, not APIs on campus necessarily, but how can they use Dropbox, WordPress, Twitter, in their careers, in their projects, and what they're doing in the classroom, and how teachers can do that. I do a lot of the speaking and workshops on that. And then I would say fourth, the tech space gets me excited sometimes. Sometimes it really aggravates me, but I always have those other projects to go back to.
What are the unsolved problems in the API space?
Unsolved problems. Well, I would start with there's a whole bunch out there right now that are made up, that are fabricated. I think that's
Like what kind?
just, marketing problems, home automation problems, things, comfort, convenience, ordering your coffee delivery, getting your coffee delivered, being able to just do things that really are first world problems, and not even first world problems. They're like privileged first world problems.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of products and a lot of investment in technology to solve those problems. But they're unsolved mostly because they're made up. They're not actually a problem, or people aren't, they're created and then, hey, this is unsolved, we've got a solution for it. They're there to sell you something. So I'd say there's a whole landscape and a whole spectrum of those. But as far as the unsolved problems that are truly out there, I would say, helping people understand what all this technology, what's going on with all this technology, what's behind the curtain, behind your credit score, what's behind the Facebook algorithm, what's behind these algorithms that are increasingly kind of governing our lives, and we have this phone in our pocket all the time, how the maps are making decisions for us, how the job sites are making decisions for us. So I would say that's a big unsolved problem, is like, how does this work? Because the more we keep these things as black boxes, the more we don't educate people and kind of include them in the conversation. I mean, a lot of times it's their data, it's their information, it's their location. If we don't kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and kind of help people understand the problem that's being solved, that we're selling them, and if we're just continually keeping them in the dark and solving our problems as startups and companies with their data, that's not going to pencil out, and that's going to just create bigger problems. But I would say, for me, the biggest problem that I hear at large organizations is technical debt and microservices. How do you, break down the monolith? And I would say the biggest problem that contributes to that is we're just applying more technology. And we're just doing this for all these wrong reasons. We're not being honest and open about why we're doing it. And so we're just creating more problems.
A Red Queen effect.
Yeah,
We just keep running faster and faster.
And we sit here and ask ourselves, how are we going to, solve these problems that our companies have? We have all of these systems that don't talk to each other. We just acquired 8 companies. How do we integrate those? Well, we're gonna just double down on more technology before we actually kind of take a pause and actually solve the problems that we have on the table, and actually do this in a, be critical about how we're using technology. So it's not really an API thing, but it is, because I feel like the API process helps us kind of lay these out on the table, have a conversation about them, figure out who owns them, hopefully ask the questions, should we even do this in the first place? So, maybe just this one and this one, not this one. Right. And so I think the API journey for me is about kind of asking these questions. So.
We have a whole lot more stories to tell, it sounds like. Capital One has thousands of developers, both internal and increasingly external. Any messages to them?
Listen to people. Don't believe the stories about developer teams, feeding them pizza and keeping them in basements. I think those days of developers are over. Mm-hmm. I think APIs for me really kind of jumped out of the service-oriented architecture, or SOA kind of petri dish. Mm-hmm. Accidentally, I would say. While the enterprise and large organizations were very focused on developing these perfect technological systems, the API kind of jumped out, kind of grew some mold, got some sunlight, and spread and became a thing. And when you think about why Twitter is popular, it's not just because the developers were able to easily do something. It's that the power users were involved. There was other people involved that weren't developers, and it was that kind of collaboration. And so if you're a developer in an organization and you're really good at what you're doing, make sure you're doing that with other people and you're having other conversations with other business groups, other teams. I think you really we gotta break down the walls of like, what is a developer, what is a business unit, what is IT, and start, I guess that's kind of what DevOps is, but it's kind of what microservices are. But I worry with those two areas, which I'm a believer, but we're still focusing on the tech too much. We need to focus on conversations, team building, collaboration, shared ownership, all those things.
Agree, absolutely. I want to thank our special guest, Ken Lane, for answering our questions. Absolutely some powerful stuff that we'll be looking to reinforce a lot of what we've already been saying for our developers in the future. If you are interested in either this or additional resources that we have available for developers, check out developer.capitalone.com, or you can go to Twitter and find our handle at twitter.com/CapitalOneDevEx.